The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald.
One. Tom and Daisy. That spring the sun shone every day. I was lonely at first in the East, but I felt that this was the real beginning of my life. I walked in the fresh air. I bought books. I worked hard. I was trying to make myself a successful businessman. One evening the phone rang. It was my cousin, Daisy. "Hello, Nick," she said in her soft voice. "Do you know we are neighbors? Tom and I are living across the bay in East Egg. I think we've settled down at last. Do come to dinner, Nick. I'd love to see you." Of course I agreed. I wanted to see my cousin Daisy again. She had married Tom Buchanan, a man I had known at Yale University. Tom had been a famous football player at college. His family was very rich, and Tom had spent money carelessly. Now he and Daisy had left Chicago, where I had last seen them. After the war, they had traveled around America and Europe. I didn't believe they had really settled down. They were too rich and too restless. So, a few days later, I drove over to East Egg. The Buchanan's house was a big one, overlooking the bay. Lawns and gardens started at the house and went down to the sea. It was late afternoon, and the weather was warm and windy. All the windows at the front of the house were wide open. Tom Buchanan stood on the porch, his legs wide apart. He was a fair-haired man of about 30. He wore smart riding clothes, and his body looked strong and cruel. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. "I've got a nice place here," Tom told me. He took hold of my arm and showed me the outside of the house. Then we looked at the rose garden and walked down to the sea. There was a big motorboat at the end of the dock. "Come inside now and see Daisy," Tom said. We walked into the house and into a high room with windows at either end. The windows were open, and the wind blew the curtains up towards the ceiling, then down towards the thick carpet. Two young women were sitting on an enormous couch. Their white dresses blew about in the wind until Tom shut the windows. The younger girl on the couch was Miss Baker. The other girl was my cousin Daisy. Daisy leant forward and gave a charming little laugh. "I'm so very happy to see you again," Daisy said. Her eyes were bright and exciting, but her smile was sad. I told Daisy that I had stayed in Chicago on my way to New York. Lots of friends had sent her their love. "That's wonderful," Daisy cried. "Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow." "I'm staying here in the East," Tom said firmly. "I'll never live anywhere else." At that moment, drinks were brought in. Miss Baker did not take one. "No, thanks," she said. "I'm in training." Tom looked at her in surprise. "You are?" He took his drink and drank it quickly. "I don't know how you get anything done." I looked at Miss Baker and wondered what she did. She was slim, with gray eyes and a pale, unhappy face. I was sure I had seen her before. "You live in West Egg," Miss Baker said to me. "I know somebody there. Gatsby. You must know Gatsby." "Gatsby?" Daisy asked quickly. "What Gatsby?" Before I could answer, we were told that dinner was ready. Tom Buchanan led me from the room. We were dining outside, on the porch. 4 candles were burning on the table. "Why candles?" said Daisy, putting them out. "It's not dark enough for candles." Miss Baker sat down at the table and yawned. "We ought to do something," she said in a tired voice. "Oh, all right," said Daisy. "What shall we do? What do people do, Nick?" she asked me. When dinner was nearly over, the phone rang in the house. The butler came out and said something quietly to Tom. Tom stood up without saying anything and went inside. Daisy smiled at me across the table. Then she suddenly stood up and walked quickly into the house. Miss Baker leant forward in her chair. "Mr. Gatsby is my neighbor," I began. "Shh," "Don't talk. I want to see what happens," Miss Baker said. "Is something happening?" I asked. "Don't you know?" Miss Baker said. "Tom's got a woman in New York. I thought everyone knew. But she shouldn't phone him at home, should she?" At that moment, Daisy and Tom came back together. "So sorry we had to leave you," Daisy said. The candles were lit again. We sat for a while in silence, finishing our wine. Then Tom and Miss Baker walked back into the house. Daisy put her elbows on the table and rested her head in her hands. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said softly. "You didn't come to my wedding." "I wasn't back from the war." "Well, that's true. Well, Nick, I've had a very bad time. I don't really care about anything anymore. Shall I tell you what I said when my daughter was born?" "Do." "Well, when I knew I had a girl, I cried. Then I was glad. I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing for a girl to be, a beautiful little fool. I think life's terrible, Nick. I've been everywhere and done everything, and I hate it all." When Daisy was speaking, I believed her. I felt sorry for her, too. Then I saw an unpleasant little smile on her lovely face, and I knew she had not been telling the truth. Inside the house, Tom and Miss Baker were sitting on the long couch. She was reading aloud from a magazine, and the light shone on her golden hair. As Daisy and I came in, Miss Baker threw down the magazine and stood up. "It's 10 o'clock, she said. "Time for me to be in bed." "Jordan's playing in the big golf match tomorrow," Daisy explained. "Oh, you're Jordan Baker," I said. I had seen her picture in the newspapers. I had heard a story about her, too, how she had behaved badly in a golf match. "Good night, Mr. Carroway," Jordan said softly. "I'll see you again sometime." "Of course you will," said Daisy. "I think I'll arrange your marriage. I'll always invite you together, and—" "Good night," Miss Baker called from the stairs. "I haven't heard a word." "She's a nice girl," said Tom after a moment, "but she shouldn't travel round the country alone." "But Nick's going to look after her now, aren't you, Nick?" said Daisy. "Jordan's from my hometown, Nick. We grew up together." Tom looked hard at Daisy. "Have you been telling Nick secrets?" he asked. "Have I?" said Daisy, smiling at me. "What did we talk about, Nick? I can't remember." "Don't believe everything she tells you, Nick," Tom said. A few minutes later I went home. Tom and Daisy came to the door and stood there together. Two rich people with everything they wanted. But Daisy had told me she was unhappy, and Tom had a woman in New York. When I got back to West Egg, I sat for a while outside my house. In the bright moonlight, a cat moved silently across the garden. As I turned my head to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, someone was standing on the lawn of Gatsby's house. The man stood very still, his hands in his pockets. I was sure it was Mr. Gatsby himself. I almost called out to him, but he seemed happy to be alone. He slowly stretched out his arms to the dark water. I looked out to sea, too. There was one green light, very small and far away. When I looked back to Gatsby again, he had gone. I was alone now, in the dark night. Two. Myrtle Wilson. About halfway between West Egg and New York, the railroad crosses a dirty, narrow river. Trains always wait there. It was because of this that I met Tom Buchanan's mistress for the first time. One Sunday afternoon, Tom and I were going up to New York by train. I could see that Tom had been drinking. When we got to the river, the train stopped as usual. A dusty road ran by the side of the railroad. It was an ugly place. Suddenly, Tom stood up and took my arm. "Come on," he said. "I want you to meet my girl. Jump down." And he pulled me off the train onto the dusty road. I followed Tom to the only building in sight. There were 3 shops in the building, and one was a garage. The sign said, "Repairs, George B. Wilson. Cars bought and sold." Tom and I went into the garage. There was one dusty old car in the corner. As I was looking around in surprise, a thin man came out of the office. "Hello, Wilson, old man," Tom shouted. "How's business?" "Not bad," said Wilson unhappily. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week. My driver's working on it now." "He works slow, doesn't he?" said Wilson. "No, he doesn't. And if you feel like that, I can sell it to someone else," Tom said angrily. "Well, I don't mean that," said Wilson. His voice stopped. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Then a woman was standing in the doorway. She was in her middle 30s. She was not beautiful, but her face and body were full of life. She smiled slowly and walked past her husband. She shook hands with Tom and looked into his eyes. "Why don't you get some chairs, George, so everyone can sit down?" she said. "All right," said George Wilson hurriedly, and he went towards the little office. "I want to see you," Tom said quickly to the woman. "Get on the next train. I'll meet you in New York." "All right." She moved away. George Wilson came out with 2 dusty chairs, but Tom had already turned to go. "It's good for Myrtle to get away," Tom said as we were waiting for the next train. "Doesn't her husband care?" "Wilson? He thinks she goes to New York to meet her sister. He's a fool." And so, Tom Buchanan, his girl, and I went up to New York. But Mrs. Wilson sat in another part of the train. At the station in New York, she bought magazines and perfume. We all got into a taxi. Almost at once, Mrs. Wilson told the driver to stop. An old man was standing by the roadside with a basket of puppies. "I want one of those dogs," Mrs. Wilson said. "It'll be nice to have one in the apartment." "What kind are they?" she asked the man. "I want a police dog." The old man looked into the basket. "I got all kinds, ma'am," he said, pulling out a puppy. "Well, that's not a police dog," said Tom. "No," said the old man. "Well, I think it's cute," said Myrtle Wilson. "How much is it?" $10, ma'am." "Oh, here's your money," said Tom impatiently to the man. "You can get 10 more dogs with it." We drove over to Fifth Avenue, and I tried to leave them there. "No, you don't," said Tom quickly. "Myrtle wants you to see the apartment, don't you, Myrtle?" "Sure," Myrtle Wilson said. "I'll phone my sister, Catherine. People say she's beautiful." So we drove on until we came to the apartment house. Myrtle Wilson got out of the taxi like a queen. "I'm going to ask the McKees to come up," she said in the elevator. "They live in the apartment below, and I'll phone my sister, too, of course." The apartment was 4 small rooms on the top floor. The living room was crowded with furniture. Mrs. Wilson sent the elevator boy out to buy food for the dog. Tom took a bottle of whiskey from a locked cupboard. I have been drunk only twice in my life. The second time was that afternoon. I remember Myrtle Wilson sitting on Tom's knee. After a time, I went out to buy some cigarettes. When I came back, the living room was empty. So I sat there smoking and reading the magazines. Just as Tom and Myrtle came out of the other room, the sister, Catherine, arrived. She was about 30, thin and red-haired, with a white face. Then the McKees came up from the apartment below. Myrtle Wilson had changed her dress. It was very tight and looked expensive. Her laughter and the way she moved had changed, too. She spoke and walked like a rich, fashionable woman. "I like your dress," said Mrs. McKee. "This old dress? I've had it for years," Myrtle laughed. "Have something to drink," Tom said to the McKees. "Get some more ice, Myrtle, before everyone goes to sleep." "I told the boy about the ice," Myrtle said angrily. "These people, you have to tell them all the time." Myrtle's sister, Catherine, sat down beside me on the couch. "Do you live on Long Island, too?" she asked me. "I live at West Egg." "Really? I was at a party there about a month ago, at the house of a man called Gatsby. Do you know him?" "I live next door to him." "Do you? He's awfully rich, you know. People say he got his money from Germany in the war. I'm afraid of him." Catherine moved closer and looked across the room at Tom and Myrtle. "Both of them are unhappily married," she said. "But Tom's wife is a Catholic. She won't divorce him." I knew this was untrue, and I was shocked. "Why'd you marry Wilson, Myrtle?" Catherine called across the room. "Nobody made you do it." Myrtle laughed. "Well, I thought he was a gentleman. I must have been crazy." Tom now sent the elevator boy to buy some sandwiches and a second bottle of whiskey. I wanted to go home. I went to the window and looked down into the dark street. Were people looking up at our lighted window and wondering what was going on? Myrtle Wilson called to me to sit down again. She began to tell me about her first meeting with Tom. "It was on the train," she said. "We couldn't stop looking at each other. When we got to New York, we got into a taxi together. I was so excited that I couldn't see where we were going, but I didn't care. You can't live forever, you know. You can't live forever." The room was filled with Myrtle's loud, false laughter. She turned to Mrs. McKee. "My dear," Myrtle said, "I'm going to give you this dress. I'm getting another tomorrow. I've got so many things to buy, a collar for the dog, an ashtray, and I must go to the hairdresser's." It was 9 o'clock. Then I looked at my watch again. It was 10. The room was full of smoke. People were coming and going, shouting to each other across the room. At about midnight, Tom and Myrtle started to argue. "Daisy, Daisy, Daisy," Myrtle Wilson was shouting. "I'll say her name whenever I want to. Daisy, Daisy." With a short, hard movement, Tom Buchanan hit her across the nose. Myrtle cried out with pain. Someone got towels. Then the towels, covered with blood, were all over the floor. People were screaming and shouting. Myrtle Wilson lay on the couch. Her nose was still bleeding, and she was crying loudly. Mr. McKee woke up and walked towards the door. I picked up my hat and followed him out. We went down in the elevator together. Then I was on the station, half asleep, waiting for the early morning train to West Egg. Three. I Meet Gatsby. My neighbor, Mr. Gatsby, gave parties all through the summer. Nearly every night his house and gardens were full of music. Men and women walked among the beautiful flowers, laughing, talking, and drinking champagne. In the afternoons, Gatsby's guests swam in the sea or sat on his beach. His motorboat roared across the bay. Every weekend, Gatsby's cars carried his guests to and from the city. Colored lights hung from the trees in Gatsby's gardens. Food was brought from New York, rich, beautiful food, and it was put on long tables under the trees. There was every kind of drink. At 7 o'clock, the band started to play. Cars from New York were parked outside Gatsby's house. Soon, everyone was a little drunk and talking to people they had never met before. As it became dark, the lights grew brighter. The music and laughter were louder now. More and more people arrived. A girl began to sing with the band. The party had started. Not all these people had been invited to Gatsby's house. All kinds of people drove out to Long Island and stopped outside Gatsby's door. Then they joined the party and started to have a good time. Sometimes they were introduced to Gatsby. Sometimes they never saw him. One day, I was invited to one of Gatsby's parties. As soon as I arrived, I began to look for Gatsby to thank him for his invitation. But no one knew where he was. As I went to get a drink, I saw Jordan Baker. I walked towards her, glad to see someone I knew. "I thought you might be here," Jordan said. We took our drinks and sat down at a small table under a tree. Jordan began to talk to a girl in a yellow dress. "Do you come to these parties often?" Jordan asked her. "Why, I come here when I can," the girl said. "No one cares what I do, so I always have a good time. Last time I was here, I tore my dress. Do you know, Gatsby sent me a new one? It cost him $265. "There's something strange about a man like that," another girl said. "He doesn't want any trouble from anybody." She leant across the table and said, "Somebody told me that Gatsby killed a man." "Oh, I heard he was a German spy," a man added. "Oh, no. He was in the American army in the war, but I'm sure he's killed a man," someone else said, and the girls laughed excitedly. Supper was now being served. Jordan and I left our table and went to look for Gatsby. The bar in the garden was crowded, but Gatsby wasn't there. We walked into the house, opened a door, and found ourselves in a library. A fat, middle-aged man was leaning against the table. He stared at us through his round glasses. "What do you think?" he asked. "All these books, they're real." "Are they?" "Sure. I thought they were made of cardboard. Here, look. Gatsby is smart. He does everything right." And the man held up a book in front of our faces. "How did you get here?" the fat man asked. "I was brought. I've been drunk for a week." He shook hands with us and smiled. Jordan and I left him and went back into the garden. People were dancing now. The voices and the laughter were very loud. The moon was high in the sky. Champagne was being served in big glasses. Jordan and I sat down at a table with a well-dressed man of my own age. I was enjoying myself now. The music stopped for a moment. The man at our table looked at me and smiled. "I think I know your face," the man said. "Weren't you in France during the war?" "Well, yes, I was." "Me too," he said. We talked about the war for a few minutes. Then the man told me that he had a new motorboat. "Wanna go out with me in the morning, old sport?" he asked. "Sure, what time?" "Oh, let's say 9 o'clock. I looked around the garden and smiled. "This is an unusual party," I told the man. "I haven't seen my host yet. Gatsby sent me an invitation this morning. I ought to thank him." The man stared at me in surprise. "Well, I'm Gatsby," he said. "I thought you knew, old sport. I'm not a very good host, am I?" Gatsby smiled. He had a pleasant smile. His smile made me feel important. I looked at Gatsby with interest. He was a tough-looking young man, but he had beautiful clothes and beautiful manners. At that moment the butler hurried up to our table. Gatsby stood up and bowed to each of us. "Chicago's on the phone. You must excuse me," he said politely. "Please ask for anything you want, old sport. I will see you again later." When Gatsby had gone into the house, I said, "Who is he, Jordan? Does anyone know?" "He's a man called Gatsby, that's all I know." "But where is he from? What does he do?" "Now you've got interested in him," Jordan smiled. "Everyone does. He told me once he was educated at Oxford, England, but I don't believe it." "Why not?" "I don't know, but who cares? He's got good manners and he gives big parties. I like big parties." There was a crash on the drums and the band leader spoke. "A new jazz tune for Mr. Gatsby," he cried. The band began to play. I looked up and saw Gatsby standing alone on the white steps in front of his house. His face was tanned, and his hair was cut short. Gatsby stood there, very straight, his hands in his pockets. I wondered why people seemed a little afraid of him. When the jazz tune ended, every girl kissed the nearest man and fell into his arms, half drunk. But there was no girl in Gatsby's arms. He stood there on the steps alone. The butler came back to our table. "Miss Baker," he said, "Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you." "To me?" Jordan got up slowly and walked into the house. It was almost 2 o'clock now. Someone was singing. I went into the house to listen. A tall woman was standing by the piano, very drunk. As she sang, she cried. Suddenly, she dropped her glass and fell back into a chair, fast asleep. It was time to go home. As I walked towards the door, Jordan Baker and Gatsby came out of the library together. "I've heard the most surprising thing," Jordan told me quietly, "but I can't tell you about it. It's a secret." She yawned. "I must go. My friends are waiting. Do phone me." A few guests were standing near Gatsby. I went up to him to say goodbye. "Don't forget we're going out in the boat, old sport," he said. "At 9 o'clock. Then the butler said, "Philadelphia wants you on the phone, Mr. Gatsby, sir." "All right, wait a minute." Gatsby smiled at me. "Good night, old sport. Good night." I walked down the steps. The lights of a dozen cars shone on the gardens. Drunken voices were saying good night. I walked across the lawn in the moonlight. The cars drove away. The gardens were quiet and empty. All alone, Gatsby stood on the white steps, waving goodbye. 4. I have lunch with Gatsby. I worked hard that summer. I met a lot of business people and began to understand my job. I enjoyed living in the East. I liked New York and its crowds of people. I didn't see Jordan Baker for a while. Then, about midsummer, we met again. Was I in love with Jordan? I don't think so, but I enjoyed being with her. Gatsby went on giving parties, and Jordan and I went to some of them. All the most fashionable people went to Gatsby's parties. They came to Gatsby's house, drank his wine, and told each other crazy stories about him. He's a bootlegger, a crook, a gambler. He's killed a man. All these things were said about Gatsby, but no one knew the truth about him. And while he went on giving parties, no one cared. One morning, late in July, Gatsby's car stopped outside my door. It was the first time Gatsby had called on me. "Good morning, old sport," he said. "You're having lunch with me today. We can drive up to New York together." Gatsby got out of his beautiful yellow car and stood beside it proudly. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" he said. "Have you seen it before?" Of course I'd seen it. Everyone in West Egg knew Gatsby's car. Yellow and silver, it shone in the morning sun. We made ourselves comfortable on the green leather seats and set off for New York. I hadn't talked much to Gatsby before. I was interested in him, but I knew very little about him. As he drove along, Gatsby didn't say anything at first, then suddenly he spoke. "Look here, old sport," he said. "What do you think of me?" Before I could answer, Gatsby went on. "You must have heard a lot of stories about me. Well, now you're going to hear the truth. I'm the son of rich people in the Middle West. They're all dead now. I grew up in America, but I was educated at Oxford. All my family went there." Gatsby looked at me for a moment. He was talking quickly, and I didn't believe a word he was saying. "What part of the Middle West are you from?" I asked. "San Francisco." "San Francisco? But that's not—" "My family died," Gatsby went on in a slow, sad voice. "After that, I lived all over Europe. I traveled, collected jewels, hunted animals. I was spending money to forget something very sad." I was so sure now that Gatsby was lying that I almost laughed. "Then the war came, old sport," Gatsby said. "I was glad. I tried to die, but I couldn't. I was a success. I won medals. Look, here's one of them." Gatsby took a medal out of his pocket. I looked at it in surprise. "Major J. Gatsby," I read, "for valor extraordinary." Then Gatsby took out a photograph. "I always carry this, too. Taken at Oxford." In the photograph, some young men were standing outside a college gate. I recognized Gatsby. Was he telling the truth, then? "I'm going to ask you a favor," Gatsby said, putting the photograph away. "That's why I've told you about myself. You'll hear more this afternoon." "This afternoon?" "Yes, when you have tea with Miss Baker. I've asked her to speak to you, about a certain matter." Gatsby drove faster. As we passed Wilson's garage, I saw Myrtle Wilson selling gas. We raced on towards the bridge. There was New York on the other side of the river. I felt excited, as I always did when I saw the city. Anything can happen in New York, I thought. Anything. I can even believe Gatsby's story. At noon, I left work to go to the restaurant where I was having lunch with Gatsby. He was already there, talking to a small, dark man with a large head. "Mr. Carraway," Gatsby said, "this is my friend, Mr. Meyer Wolfsheim." Gatsby led us to a table and ordered drinks. "This is a nice restaurant," said Mr. Wolfsheim, looking round. "But the place across the street is better." "What place is that?" I asked. "The old Metropole," Mr. Wolfsheim said sadly. "I remember the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal over there. Shot him 4 times and then drove away. Poor Rosie. He was a good friend of mine." The food arrived, and Mr. Wolfsheim began to eat greedily. All the time he was eating, he was watching everyone in the room. Gatsby suddenly looked at his watch. He stood up and hurried out. "He has the phone," said Mr. Wolfsheim. "He does a lot of business with Chicago. Gatsby's a fine fellow, isn't he? Good-looking and a perfect gentleman. He's an Oxford man, you know." "Oh, is he? Have you known Gatsby for long?" I asked. "Several years," Wolfsheim answered. "I met him after the war. He comes from a good family. He's a gentleman to everyone, especially women. He'd never look at another man's wife." When Gatsby came back to our table, Mr. Wolfsheim got to his feet and looked round the room. "I have enjoyed my lunch," he said, "but I've got to leave you 2 young men now." And he hurried away. "Wolfsheim's well known on Broadway," Gatsby told me. "Well, who is he, then? An actor?" "No, Meyer Wolfsheim's a gambler. He's clever, but he's done a lot of dangerous things." "Has he ever been in jail?" "Oh, they can't prove anything, old sport. He's too smart." It was time to go. As we stood up, I saw Tom Buchanan on the other side of the crowded room. When he saw me, Tom came over. "Where you been?" he asked me angrily. "Daisy wants to know why you haven't phoned." "This is Mr. Gatsby, Mr. Buchanan," I said. The 2 men shook hands without speaking. There was a strange look on Gatsby's face. "Well, how are you?" Tom asked me. "And why are you eating here?" "I've been having lunch with Mr. Gatsby." And I turned to speak to Gatsby, but he had gone. 5. Daisy and Gatsby. Start of the dream. Later that afternoon, I met Jordan Baker at the Plaza Hotel. After tea, she told me that Gatsby had known Daisy. They had known each other in the Middle West 5 years before. "Daisy and I grew up in the same town," Jordan began. "In 1917, Daisy was 18. She was the most beautiful and the most popular girl in Louisville. Her family was very rich. Daisy always dressed in white, and she had a little white car. She went out with all the young officers. The telephone in her house rang all day long. One day in October, I was walking past Daisy's house. Daisy was sitting in her car with an officer I hadn't seen before. They were so busy talking that they didn't see me. But I remember the way the young officer looked at Daisy. To him, she was the most beautiful thing in the world. About a month later, Daisy's mother found her packing her bag to go to New York. Daisy wanted to say goodbye to an officer who was going overseas. Her family stopped her, of course. "Was the officer Gatsby?" I asked. "Of course," said Jordan. Daisy was sad for a time and didn't go out much. By the following autumn, she was gay again. In February, she got engaged to a young man from New Orleans. But in June, she married Tom Buchanan from Chicago. It was the biggest wedding our town had ever seen. "Were you there?" I asked. "I was a bridesmaid," Jordan said. On the day before the wedding, Tom gave Daisy some pearls worth $350,000. That evening, Daisy's family was giving a big dinner. Half an hour before the dinner started, I went up to Daisy's room, Jordan went on. The pearls were on the floor. Daisy was lying on the bed with a bottle of wine in one hand and a letter in the other. She was very drunk. "Never had a drink before," Daisy said, "but how I enjoy it." She picked up the pearls and said, "Here, take them downstairs. Tell them Daisy's changed her mind." Then she began to cry. She cried and cried. I found her mother's maid and we got Daisy into a cold bath. The letter in her hand came to pieces in the water. Half an hour later, Daisy walked downstairs. She looked very beautiful, and the pearls were round her neck. Next day, Daisy married Tom Buchanan, and they went on their honeymoon. I met them again when they came back. I've never seen a girl so in love with her husband. That was in August. A week later, Tom crashed his car. The girl with him broke her arm, and the story got into the papers. The girl was a maid from the hotel. The following April, Daisy had a baby girl, and the family went to France for a year. Then they went back to Chicago. Well, about 6 weeks ago, I asked you about Gatsby, Jordan went on. Daisy heard me. She knew he was the same man she had known in Louisville. "It's strange that Gatsby came east, too," I said. "But it isn't strange at all," Jordan replied. "Gatsby came here to be near Daisy. He can see her house across the bay." Then there was a reason for all those parties. Gatsby had hoped that one evening Daisy would walk into his house. "Gatsby wants you to do something for him," Jordan was saying. "He wants you to invite Daisy to tea. Then he'll call in, too. He wants to show Daisy his house." I thought for a moment. Gatsby wasn't asking very much. He had waited 5 years. He had given big parties to strangers. And why? To see Daisy one afternoon at tea. "Does Daisy want to meet Gatsby again?" I asked. "Oh, she doesn't know about it," Jordan answered. "Gatsby wants it to be a surprise." It was dark outside by now. I asked Jordan out to dinner, and we took a taxi. It was a beautiful night. I had heard enough about Daisy and Gatsby. I put my arm around Jordan, looked into her gray eyes, and kissed her. Six. Daisy comes to tea. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning when I got home. For a moment, I thought my house was on fire. Then I saw that all the lights were on in Gatsby's house, but everything was silent. There was no music and no happy laughter. As I stood there, Gatsby walked across the lawn towards me. "I thought it was a party," I said. "No, I'm all alone, old sport. Why not come for a drive in my car?" "It's too late." "Well, what about a swim? I haven't used the pool all summer." "I've got to go to bed," I said. "All right, old sport. but Gatsby did not move. I knew what he wanted to ask me. "I've had a talk with Miss Baker," I said. "I'll phone Daisy tomorrow. What day would be best? I don't want to put you to any trouble."